The sound of the chair scraping across the floor still echoes in my mind, a reminder of the shove they gave me as their guests laughed. Still, I didn't let it show. As the air grew thicker with their laughter, I watched the edges of my world fracture, betrayed, humiliated, but composed. While the cold sting of their disrespect settled in, I realized I'd had enough. That's when the truth hit me. They thought they had power. I turned away quietly. The next day, the house was no longer theirs. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Helen stepped out of her car, the cool evening air biting at her skin as she approached the front door of Travis and Janine's home. The house stood just like it always had, a little too pristine, a little too perfect. As she rang the doorbell, she could hear laughter from inside, mingling with the hum of conversation. It was a warm sound, comforting even, until she thought of how much she'd once hoped for her son to settle into a life that included her in it, and how much that had shifted in recent years. When the door opened, Janine's smile was as sharp as ever, teeth gleaming too white under the dim porch light. "Helen, welcome. You look lovely," she said, though there was something forced in her voice. Janine stepped back to let her in, the warmth of the house spilling out into the crisp fall evening. Helen managed a smile, the kind that was polite but didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you," she replied, following Janine down the hallway toward the kitchen, where Travis stood, a beer in hand, talking animatedly to a neighbor. His eyes flicked over to her when she entered, and his expression shifted, a slight tightening of his jaw that only she noticed. "Mom, hey," he said, as though her presence didn't quite sit right with him. Janine led her to the table, already set with dinner. The casserole Helen had spent hours preparing, a dish she knew they liked, full of flavor and warmth, sat in the middle of the table, steaming. She took her seat, looking around at the guests. There were two couples, neighbors she recognized from down the street, all of them chatting and laughing in that way people did when they wanted to seem effortlessly at ease. It felt strange, like an illusion she didn't belong to. Helen set down her napkin, watching as Janine leaned over the casserole. "A casserole, really?" Janine's tone was light, but Helen could hear the sharp edge beneath it. "You couldn't have picked something a little more exciting? I mean, it's just so heavy." The comment stung more than Helen expected. She thought about all the effort, the time she'd put into cooking, but held her tongue, not wanting to rock the boat on what was supposed to be a nice evening. Travis cleared his throat, casting a quick glance at his wife. "It's fine, Mom. Don't worry about it. She's just being picky." Helen smiled softly, reaching for her glass of water. "No trouble at all," she said, trying to lighten the mood. But the tension hung in the air, thick and palpable. As they sat down to eat, the conversation drifted toward work and neighborhood gossip. Travis, after a few more beers, began making jokes. At first, they were harmless, teasing comments about the weather or a local sports game. But then he leaned back in his chair, his gaze flicking toward Helen. "Yeah, Mom's the real queen of casserole making. You should see her in the kitchen, folks," he said, laughing a little too loudly. "I swear, it's like she's auditioning for a spot in one of those food shows. Maybe she'll get her own show. Cooking with Helen, right? Casserole every day." A few of the neighbors chuckled, but Helen felt her cheeks flush. Travis's joke hung in the air, awkward as if she were somehow the punchline. She tried to smile, but it felt thin, stretched. The room was quieter now, the energy changing in small, unnoticed ways. Helen placed her fork down, the metal clinking softly against the plate. "I think I'll head out early, actually," she said, keeping her voice steady. But she felt the words sticking in her throat. She was used to being the one who made an effort, who held the family together. Wasn't that what mothers did? but it felt like her presence here, tonight, was nothing more than an inconvenience. Before anyone could respond, Travis stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back in the process. He reached for her shoulder, the action swift. Too fast. "Come on, Mom, you're not really going to leave, are you?" he said, his voice more forceful now, not a joke anymore. Helen, startled by the shove, caught herself against the back of the chair. "I'll be fine," she murmured, standing to her feet slowly, the dizziness of the moment threatening to knock her off balance. Then Janine moved in, a quiet push that sent her shoulder slamming against the table. The guests stilled, but they said nothing. The air in the room seemed to compress, thick and suffocating. Janine's voice cut through the silence, too casual, too cold. "Oh, relax, Helen," she sneered. "We're just having a little fun. No need to get so worked up." Helen's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't cry. She didn't shout. She simply steadied herself, drawing in a deep breath. She could feel the heat of their eyes on her, but it didn't matter. She straightened, met their gazes briefly, then walked toward the door, the sound of her heels tapping on the hardwood floor loud in the silence that followed. No one stopped her. Outside, the air was sharp and biting as she made her way to the car. She didn't feel the sting of tears, but she felt the burn of something else. Something more raw and primal. She'd been shoved aside in her own family, but what she realized in that moment, as she settled into the driver's seat, was that the house was still hers, and they would learn that soon enough. She turned the key, the engine purring to life, and drove off into the night, the glow of the streetlights flickering like distant stars, guiding her towards something much darker than she'd ever imagined. Helen's hands gripped the steering wheel as she navigated the quiet streets of Omaha, the headlights casting long, stretching shadows against the pavement. The engine hummed beneath her, a steady, rhythmic sound that matched the stillness inside her. The sting of what had just happened, the shove, the laughter, the coldness of her son and daughter-in-law, was still there. But it was a dull ache now, like a bruise forming beneath the surface. She didn't cry. She hadn't even come close to it. Instead, a calmness settled over her like a blanket, heavy and comforting in its simplicity. She focused on the road ahead, the glow of the streetlights blurring as they passed by. It was as if her body had already disconnected from the emotions that should have been tearing her apart, as if some part of her had already started planning the next steps. The familiar sight of her house, nestled in the quiet neighborhood, appeared ahead, its porch light flickering on in the distance. As she pulled into her driveway, the porch light flicked off, only to come back on moments later, steady and unwavering. She recognized the gesture immediately. Lou Grant. Her neighbor. Her friend. The one person who always seemed to know when something was wrong. She hadn't told him about the dinner, about Travis and Janine's behavior. But he had a way of sensing it anyway. There was a certain kind of knowingness in his eyes, the kind that came from years of living next to someone. Helen stepped out of the car, the cool air hitting her face, sharp and refreshing. She didn't look at the house. Not yet. She just made her way to the front door, her shoes clicking on the concrete path, the rhythm of her footsteps slow but deliberate. By the time she reached the door, Lou was already on the porch, leaning against the railing with his arms crossed, his expression full of concern. He didn't need to say anything. The look on her face said it all. "You're back early," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying a weight that matched the heaviness in the air between them. Helen nodded, not trusting herself to speak yet. She didn't want to break. Not now. She just wanted to get inside. Find the things that would anchor her. But Lou's presence was a comfort, and she appreciated his steadying silence as much as the questions he didn't ask. He straightened up and stepped closer, his old bones creaking but his eyes still sharp. "You're all right, Helen?" She looked at him, her lips pressed tight together, before slowly nodding again. "I'm fine. Just tired." Lou didn't buy it, of course. He never did. But he didn't push. Instead, he just stood there for a moment, his gaze flicking over her, like he was searching for something unspoken. Helen finally broke the silence. "I don't know what I expected," she said softly, her voice just above a whisper. Maybe I thought things would be different. But I'm tired, Lou. I'm tired of pretending it's okay when it isn't." Lou didn't say anything for a long moment. His eyes softened, understanding the unspoken truth in her words. "You've been a good mother, Helen. Sometimes. Sometimes they just don't know how to see it. But you still own half that house." The words cut through the air like a blade, sharp and clear. Helen didn't flinch, though. In fact, the truth of it brought something else rising in her, a quiet, steady kind of resolve. "Half the house," she repeated, her voice distant now, as if she were speaking to herself more than Lou. Lou watched her for a moment, his hands still resting on the railing. "You're not the one who needs to apologize, Helen. And I've always said, you got a lot more strength in you than you give yourself credit for." She didn't answer. Instead, she gave him a small, tired smile, the kind that barely curved her lips, but still held gratitude in its quiet space. "Thanks, Lou," she said, her voice soft again. She gave him a nod and stepped inside, leaving him standing there, his figure slowly fading into the shadows of the porch. Inside, the house felt different. Larger, emptier, more distant. She didn't know if it was the isolation or the weight of what had happened, but it was like the walls had closed in a little tighter around her. She locked the door behind her and moved toward the hallway, pausing briefly at the framed family pictures that lined the walls. She didn't linger on any one image. They all looked so distant, like moments from another life. Her eyes landed on the safe, tucked away in the corner of the living room. She walked toward it without thinking, her fingers already knowing the combination. She opened it slowly, the sound of the mechanism clicking in the silence of the house. She reached inside and pulled out the original escrow folder, the one that held all the financial documents and receipts from the purchase of Travis's house, the one that proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that her contributions had been more than just a gift. She opened the folder, her fingers tracing the edges of the pages with an almost reverent touch. She could feel her heart beating in her chest, steady now, with purpose. Tonight, she thought. Tonight was the night everything would change. She reached for her logbook, a small leather-bound book she'd kept for years. She opened it to the last blank page and carefully added tonight's date, her handwriting neat and deliberate as she wrote, "Dinner, the push, the beginning." Helen closed the logbook with a quiet snap, the sound filling the room with a finality that settled deep in her chest. The house was still hers. And soon, so would be everything else. She walked to the window, her eyes scanning the quiet neighborhood. The streetlights flickered in the distance, and in that moment she knew. Tomorrow, things would be different. She shut the blinds with a soft click, and the house fell into a peaceful silence. The sun had barely risen when Helen stepped out into the cool morning air, her breath visible in short puffs as she walked to her car. The city of Omaha was still waking up. Streets quiet, the sky a soft blue that deepened into daylight. It was a time of transition, much like herself. She drove downtown, her hands steady on the wheel, the weight of the coming day pressing against her chest. She had no intention of crying. The time for tears had passed. This was business, pure and simple. And soon, Travis and Janine would understand just how wrong they'd been to underestimate her. When she reached Charlotte Hayes's office, The sharp steel and glass exterior of the building reflected the early light, making the city seem colder than it was. Helen walked through the doors. The familiar scent of polished wood and coffee greets her. Charlotte's office was on the second floor, tucked away at the end of a long corridor, and as Helen entered, the attorney looked up from behind her desk. Charlotte Hayes was a woman of few words, her presence a quiet force. She had a way of cutting through the noise, focusing on the task at hand with surgical precision. As Helen closed the door behind her, Charlotte gave her a brief nod of acknowledgement, her sharp eyes assessing her without question. "You're early," Charlotte remarked as she stood and gestured for Helen to take a seat across from her. "That's good." Helen offered a small smile, the weight of the night's events still lingering. "I wanted to get this over with." Charlotte nodded, already flipping open the folder Helen had placed on the desk. It was filled with documents, receipts, bank statements, the escrow files from the original purchase. Everything. Helen had brought it all. Everything she could gather to show how much she had contributed to the house, from the down payment to the renovations, all in black and white proof. Charlotte scanned the papers quickly, her sharp eyes moving faster than most people could follow. She didn't flinch at the totals. "You've been more than generous, Helen," Charlotte said, almost casually, as she read through the pages. "But more importantly, you've legally backed it all up. The timing, the records, it's all here. You've got equity in this house, significant equity." Helen nodded, her fingers tightening around the edges of the chair. The words, so simple, were the confirmation she'd been seeking. "What does that mean?" "Legally, I mean." Charlotte leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against her desk. "It means," she said slowly, "that you hold leverage. You hold more than just a sentimental stake in this house. The papers, Helen, these documents, they give you rights. The kind of rights people can't easily ignore." Helen swallowed, the gravity of the situation settling into her bones. "And they never even read them," she muttered, her voice low. "Not their fault. Most people don't," Charlotte replied, her tone neutral but tinged with a touch of professional disdain. "That's the problem with relying on someone else's word. You've done everything by the book. They haven't. The house, the loan, they've been living in your shadow, Helen. And they don't even know it." Helen looked at the papers again, her gaze lingering on the dates, the amounts, the signatures. Everything that proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that she had given them the opportunity to have a home. She had helped them. She had paid their way. And now it was her time to take back what was hers. "I've been a fool, haven't I?" Helen said, more to herself than to Charlotte. The question was one of realization, of finally accepting the depth of her role in this mess. She had been the giver, the enabler. But she wouldn't be that anymore. Charlotte raised an eyebrow but didn't respond right away. Instead, she stood and walked over to a file cabinet, pulling out a stack of legal papers. She laid them down on the desk in front of Helen with a swift motion. "No, you've just been a mother. A good one. But that's over now. It's time to be smart." Helen's eyes scanned the papers. The first was a property claim action draft, the beginnings of what Charlotte intended to file with the county. She could almost hear the rustle of it in the air, the beginning of something that would turn the world upside down for Travis and Janine. Lou's voice echoed in her mind from the night before, soft but firm. "You still own half that house." She felt her pulse quicken. But this wasn't just about ownership. It was about respect. And they had shown her none. Charlotte looked at her with an unwavering gaze. "We're going to file this, soon. The moment they challenge it, we'll hit them with everything you've got. The documents, the funds, the timeline, the clear neglect. They won't stand a chance. And you, Helen, will finally get what you're owed." Helen swallowed, her breath coming a little faster now. The adrenaline, the anticipation, It all mixed together in a perfect storm of resolve. "When?" she asked, her voice steady. "Tomorrow?" Charlotte said simply. "Or we wait." "But I'm ready. We can initiate the claim now. You've waited long enough." The weight of it hit her then. The finality of it. She wasn't just going to take back what was hers. She was going to make them feel every single moment of disrespect they had shown her. This wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about regaining her life, her dignity. She nodded, a small, quiet determination filling her chest. "Let's do it," she said, the words sharp and clear. Charlotte handed her the pen. The weight of that pen was heavier than anything she had ever signed before. But this time, she didn't hesitate. And as the ink flowed, so did the first real sense of control Helen had felt in years. The game was on. And this time, Helen Watterson was in charge. The house was quiet, but Helen could feel the tension still thick in the air. It wasn't the kind of silence she'd once found peaceful. Now it was like a quiet before a storm, a kind of holding pattern that stretched and stretched. She sat at the kitchen table, the remnants of her breakfast untouched, her gaze fixed on the window. Outside, the world carried on, oblivious to the slow churn of change that was already in motion. Her phone buzzed on the counter, an unexpected interruption. It was a text from Janine. "You're being unreasonable. We didn't mean it. Come on, you know we care. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Helen stared at the message. Her finger hovered over the screen, the urge to respond nearly overwhelming. She could feel the anger rising. Just the words alone made her feel small again, insignificant, like she was still the person they pushed around. But she didn't respond. She didn't owe Janine anything. Not anymore. Not a single word. Instead, she set the phone down, turned away from it, and focused on something more important. It had taken all of one night for the weight of everything to feel different. And now, with the sun hanging low in the sky, she could breathe again. The house was hers in a way it hadn't been before. Not just legally. No, this was something deeper. She'd taken back control, and there was a certain lightness in that, a sense of clarity. She moved to the living room, where boxes of old files sat piled on the floor, remnants of her past attempts to keep everything in order. Her work as a billing specialist had required her to keep meticulous records, years of patient files, financial documents, every receipt and contract carefully cataloged. She'd done it all without question, thinking it was just what was expected of her, what mothers did. Now it felt like something else entirely. Each piece of paper was like a small weight she was finally ready to shed. She spent the next hour sifting through the files, clearing away the remnants of an old life she no longer needed. Old tax returns, medical bills, the occasional birthday card tucked between papers. It was all moving out of her life, piece by piece. And with each page she discarded, the space around her seemed to open up. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Janine. The message came from Bella. "Grandma, I'm so sorry for last night. I don't want things to be like this. I love you." Helen's chest tightened as she read the words. Bella had always been kind, always tried to be the bridge between her parents and Helen, even when things had started to sour. It hurt her that Bella was caught in the middle, but Helen knew better than to respond in haste. She took a breath, her fingers dancing over the screen as she typed out a message. "I know you do, Bella, and I love you too. Don't worry, things will be okay." It was the simplest thing she could offer, but it felt right. She hit send and felt a small release in her chest. Bella would be okay. They both would be. Helen heard the soft chime of the doorbell, a welcome distraction. She pushed the last of the files into a cardboard box and walked toward the door, her thoughts still with Bella, still heavy with the knowledge that her family had been treating her as less than. But that was changing now. Lou stood on the other side of the door, his weathered face wearing the same look of concern and quiet understanding he always wore. In his hand was a stack of papers. "Thought you might need some help getting this together," Lou said, his voice a steady anchor in the storm of her thoughts. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, as he always had. "Thanks, Lou," Helen said, giving him a tired but genuine smile. She gestured toward the kitchen table where a new set of financial documents lay scattered. "I'm almost done with the old stuff, but I still need to get these organized." Lou nodded, his hands working quickly as he pulled out the home equity statements Helen had collected. He sorted them into neat piles as if it were second nature to him. There was a rhythm to it. Lou had always been meticulous, and his help grounded her, made the mountain of paperwork seem less insurmountable. "Charlotte's got the trust conversion draft ready," Lou said, glancing over his shoulder at Helen. "Once you sign, it'll all be in your name. A little more legal protection just in case. Not that I think Travis will fight it, but it never hurts to be prepared." Helen felt the weight of his words, a stark reminder that this was all becoming very real. She had been so focused on the immediate aftermath of the dinner, the rush of reclaiming what was rightfully hers, that she hadn't let the full impact of the situation settle in. Lou was right. This wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about her future, a future that was beginning to look very different. "Thanks, Lou," Helen said again, the words feeling more sincere each time. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Lou grinned, the smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "You'd manage, Helen. Always have. But it's nice to know I've been of use." She watched as Lou continued organizing the paperwork, the trust conversion draft sitting on top, waiting for her signature. But she didn't rush toward it. Not yet. There was time, and when she did sign it, it would be her final step. There would be no turning back. For now, she let herself linger in the moment. Let herself feel the quiet before the storm. Because when the storm hit, it would be her turn to dictate the terms. Lou finished the sorting and stepped back, hands on his hips. "You ready?" Helen didn't answer immediately. She stood still, taking in the space around her, the quiet that had taken hold of the house. She had a plan now. She had the strength, the legal power. And soon, she would take everything back. "Soon," she said, her voice steady but with a quiet certainty. "Soon, Lou." As he nodded and turned to leave, the door closed behind him with a soft click, and Helen sat down at the kitchen table staring at the papers in front of her. Tomorrow, she thought, tomorrow, the game would change for good. Helen sat at the kitchen table, her fingers trembling slightly as they hovered over the trust conversion document. The weight of the decision she was about to make seemed heavier now, more real. The quiet in the house was almost deafening as she stared at the words, each line drawing her closer to the point of no return. The room seemed to shrink around her, her focus narrowing to the sharp, crisp text in front of her. The pen felt foreign in her hand, its smooth surface cool against her fingertips. But it wasn't the pen she was holding. It was the future she was about to write for herself. She had spent years looking the other way, believing in family, in sacrifice, in doing what was right. But now, after everything that had transpired, the reality of it all had shifted. This was no longer about motherly love or expectation. It was about power, control, and the recognition she had been denied for too long. The sound of footsteps on the porch echoed through the house, a familiar rhythm. Helen's gaze didn't leave the page as the door opened behind her. "Everything in order?" Lou's voice broke the silence gently, but it was enough to make her glance up. He stood in the doorway, carrying the notarized documents in hand, his steady presence grounding her. "Almost," she said, her voice steady, but there was something else beneath it, a quiet certainty. Lou set the documents on the table beside her, giving her a moment of space. She didn't need to look at him to know he was waiting. Waiting for her to make the decision. Waiting for her to take the step that would change everything. Charlotte had prepared the documents with care, outlining everything. Helen's share of the property, the trust conversion, the revocation of past verbal agreements. It was all here. Every bit of legal backing she needed to claim full control. But what really mattered now wasn't the paperwork. It was what Helen had always feared, the finality of it. The knowledge that once this was signed, there would be no going back. Helen reached for the pen, her breath steady but deep. She felt her pulse quicken as she clicked the pen, the sharp sound echoing in the stillness of the room. The motion felt almost symbolic, a simple action that had the power to erase years of unacknowledged effort. She pressed the pen to the paper, and just like that, it was done. She looked down at her signature, the ink still fresh against the page, the line bold and unyielding. The house was no longer just a place she had helped build. It was now hers in a way that no one could dispute. She could feel the weight lifting from her shoulders, a burden she hadn't even realized was there until it was gone. Lou took the document from her, his hand steady as he began to add his own stamp of verification, his eyes briefly meeting hers. "You're sure about this?" he asked, his voice low, as if the moment deserved respect. Helen nodded. "I've never been more sure of anything." With that, Lou moved to the stack of papers, placing the notarized copies neatly on top. He looked at her once more before slipping them into a folder. His eyes were unreadable, but Helen could see the pride there. Pride for her, and pride in the careful work they'd done. "I'll get this filed with the county records," Lou said, standing up. "Charlotte will handle the trust conversion draft next. You've got everything lined up now." Helen's gaze drifted back to the document in front of her, now full of names and legalities. There was a certain peace in knowing it was finally in motion. But as she turned the page, something else caught her eye. The next line, the next step. She reached for her phone, her fingers typing quickly. "Add Bella as secondary beneficiary. Make sure she has everything when I'm gone." It was the only way to ensure that her granddaughter, the only one who had ever truly tried to understand, would be protected. Bella didn't deserve to be caught in the aftermath of her parents' mistakes. Helen would make sure of that. She tapped send, the simple action carrying more weight than she'd expected. As the minutes ticked by, Charlotte's voice echoed in her mind, calm and precise. "We can initiate a full claim now." It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about taking back what was rightfully hers, about showing her family that the world had changed. Lou's voice broke through her thoughts. "We've done it, Helen. There's nothing left to stop you now." Helen stood, her legs a little unsteady at first, but she found her balance quickly. The documents had been signed. The claim would be filed. She turned toward the window, her eyes scanning the street outside. The same street she had walked down for years. The same street where her son and daughter-in-law lived. They would never know the full scope of what was coming. Not yet, but they would. She could almost hear the laughter from the dinner, the cruel jokes, the mockery. It had been their way of laughing at her, but soon, it would be her turn to rewrite the story. Helen walked toward the door, the weight of the future pressing on her like a force she could no longer ignore. She didn't have to wait any longer. It was time for the world to know that the house was hers, and everything else was going to follow. As the door clicked shut behind her, Helen felt something stir inside her, a quiet, powerful sense of control. The first step had been taken. The next would follow. And when it did, there would be no turning back. The phone buzzed again. Helen stared at it, the screen lighting up in front of her. It was Travis. She didn't even have to read the message. She already knew what it said. The same anger. The same hurt. just now with more desperation behind it. She could almost hear his voice, shrill with indignation, blaming her for everything. "How could you do this to us?" he would say. "We're family. You owe us." Her finger hovered over the screen for a moment, the weight of his calls pulling at her, almost tempting her to pick up, to finally confront him face to face. But she knew better. She had learned better. Instead, she let it ring. Let it fill the empty space in the room with its shrill insistence. Let it fade into the background as if it didn't matter at all. Because it didn't. The phone stopped ringing and switched to voicemail. Helen turned it over, the smooth glass screen reflecting back the quiet, steady calm of her face. She didn't need to listen to it. Helen's gaze drifted toward the small stack of papers that lay on the table, the trust conversion documents now filed away, her legal rights secure. She could feel it now, truly feel it. The finality of her actions, the shift in the power dynamics, the knowledge that her world was hers again, a thing that had been taken from her for too long. Lou's voice broke her thoughts. "I'll log it," he said, his voice low, focused. She turned toward him, watching as he placed the phone down, already recording the contact attempt into his notebook with deliberate care. She didn't need to say anything. He understood. It wasn't just Travis who would be calling now. They'd all come after her, looking for an apology or an explanation, but there was nothing left to explain. Helen nodded, her eyes returning to the papers, her mind already moving forward. Lou was meticulous, a man of systems. As he continued logging each attempt to contact Helen, she busied herself with her own tasks. It felt right, the way he worked. Methodical, clear-headed. The trust's digital backups had to be updated, passwords changed, every access point sealed. It wasn't just about taking control of the house anymore. It was about protecting what was hers from everything else. She sat down at the desk, typing in her new passwords one by one. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she updated bank accounts, investment records, and even old insurance policies. Every piece of her life, now under her control. Her accounts were hers again. Her life, truly hers. Travis's calls? He didn't have a claim to any of it anymore. Helen set her phone on silent and tucked it away in her drawer. The act felt symbolic, as if the device that had once been a constant source of guilt, obligation, and manipulation could now be silenced with a simple press of a button. Her relationships, her obligations, all of it, quieted. It wasn't that she didn't love them, it was that they hadn't loved her back. Not in the way she needed. Lou finished his work and turned toward her, a slight frown crossing his features. "Travis is on a rampage online," he said, his voice calm but laced with something else. Concern, maybe. "He's posting about you, calling it a betrayal. He's already made it clear he's not going to back down." Helen nodded, unbothered. She wasn't surprised. She'd expected nothing less. The truth was, this kind of fury was what she had come to expect from him. But it didn't touch her anymore. Not the way it used to. "I'll handle it," she said, her voice steady. She took a slow breath, feeling a strange calmness wash over her. Let him rage. It doesn't matter anymore. Lou didn't say anything more about it. He knew there was no convincing her otherwise. The storm was coming, but for the first time in a long time, Helen was ready for it. She wasn't scared of the fallout. She had endured too much for too long to let their anger shake her. As Lou turned to leave, Helen poured herself a cup of tea, the steam curling up in soft wisps, the delicate clink of the teacup against the saucer like a soft exhale. She sat back in her chair, cradling the cup in her hands. The warm liquid calmed her, grounding her as she stared out the window. The sun was dipping lower in the sky, the light casting long shadows across the lawn. The world was changing around her. Slowly, but surely. She could hear the faint sounds of her phone buzzing in the distance. More messages, more calls, more noise, but none of it reached her. None of it mattered. Helen sipped her tea, unhurried, and let the world spin on without her. She had done what she needed to do, and now, for the first time in years, she could just breathe. Soon, Travis and Janine would learn what it meant to lose control. And when that day came, they would understand that the house was just the beginning. Helen finished her tea, feeling the weight of everything lift just a little more. She didn't have to rush. There was no hurry anymore. The game had changed. And now, it was her turn to win. The first message came through just as Helen was finishing her tea, the screen of her phone lighting up with the familiar name, Travis. Her hand didn't even hesitate as she reached for the device. She'd been expecting this. She tapped the screen, the message flooding her with the same angry, familiar tone. "You've crossed the line, Mom. This is unforgivable. I can't believe you're doing this to us. We didn't deserve this. You've ruined everything." Helen set the phone back down, reading the words again in her mind. The anger was palpable, his voice still echoing in her head. But it didn't bother her anymore. The panic in his words, the sense of betrayal, it was all part of the game now. The next message came an hour later, then another, then one more. Each one grew more frantic, more desperate. "If you don't undo this, we'll be forced to take legal action. This is insane, Mom." And again, "You'll regret this. You've destroyed this family." Helen kept them all. She didn't need to listen to the voicemail. They were all saved, filed away as evidence. She could feel the weight of the words, the anger in them, but she remained unmoved. They were just words. And they wouldn't change anything. Lou had already set up the system, making sure that everything was documented, every call and message stored safely. He was meticulous, efficient. This wasn't the first time she'd needed to protect herself, and it wouldn't be the last. Helen was still in the kitchen when the phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a text. It was Charlotte. "Financial freeze complete. Your accounts are now fully protected. I've added the necessary blocks for anything suspicious. They won't be able to access your assets." Helen nodded to herself, a slow, quiet breath slipping out. She could feel the protective layers she had built around herself. The house was hers, the trust secure, and now, her finances were locked down tight. There was nothing left to chance. "Good," she whispered aloud, just as the door creaked open behind her. Lou stepped inside, his face slightly creased with thought. "All set up. New camera systems in place. They won't be able to get to you without us seeing it coming." He held up a small device, the new security system ready for use, the screens hooked up and monitored. Helen had been careful about security. She knew that once Travis and Janine realized what was happening, they'd do whatever they could to get back at her, and she wasn't about to leave anything to chance. "Thank you, Lou," Helen said, standing up slowly and meeting his eyes. There was something unspoken between them now, an understanding. They were on the same side, and for the first time she could feel her trust in him complete. He nodded once and left her to her thoughts, the door clicking shut behind him. Helen walked slowly to her desk, feeling the weight of the situation around her. She glanced at the photos on the walls, her family when it had been whole. But she wasn't looking at them with the same affection anymore. The faces, once so familiar, now seemed distant, like a dream she was slowly waking from. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was from Bella. "Grandma, I don't know what's going on, but I don't want to take sides. I just want things to be okay again. I'm sorry." Helen's chest tightened. She had always been there for Bella, had always tried to shield her from the mess that had been her son's life. But now, there was no way to protect her from the consequences of Travis and Janine's actions. She felt a rush of tenderness for her granddaughter and immediately began to type, the words coming from her heart. Bella, I know you're caught in the middle and I'm so sorry, but know this. This isn't about you. I love you, and I always will. Don't worry about them. Focus on yourself. Take care of you. You deserve that. Helen set her phone down, feeling a quiet sadness that she couldn't protect Bella from this, but also a deep resolve that she would do what was necessary to secure Bella's future. It would be her turn to make things right when the time came. She stood up from the desk, the weight of the day pressing down on her. She walked to the door, then stepped outside, needing the fresh air, needing to step away from the suffocating tension of her own house. The cold air hit her face, sharp and refreshing, the quiet of the world outside offering a stark contrast to the storm that was brewing inside. The streetlights were starting to flicker on, casting long shadows down the empty street. The wind whispered through the trees, and Helen took a deep breath, letting the silence wash over her. The neighborhood was calm, peaceful, completely unaware of the battle that was raging just under the surface. She walked slowly down the street, the soft crunch of her shoes on the pavement the only sound. The house was behind her now, the place that had once been a symbol of family, now just a symbol of her new beginning. And that was fine. As she walked, she let her mind wander, thinking of everything she had done, everything she had secured. Her life, her peace, and her future. They would be hers, no matter what Travis and Janine thought. The phone had stopped buzzing. The storm was coming, but it would be on her terms now. Helen knew they would be back. She knew the chaos wasn't over. But for now, as she stood on the quiet street, she felt an overwhelming sense of control. The panic they had earned was just beginning, and she would make sure they never saw it coming. The knock at the door came late in the morning, the sound echoing sharply through the otherwise quiet house. Helen wasn't surprised. She had expected this. The envelope she received from Travis's lawyer was thick, heavier than she had anticipated. She knew exactly what it was before she even opened it. Inside, the letter was precisely what she'd expected, full of accusations and demands. "You're reneging on promises made years ago," the lawyer's letter read. "You've chosen to betray your family by taking advantage of your position in this manner. We intend to take legal action if you do not return to a state of good faith and reconsider your actions." Helen set the letter down on the kitchen counter, not even flinching at the words. She didn't need to. She had expected Travis to go this route, legal threats, the weapon of someone who didn't have anything left to hold on to but their pride. The truth was, Travis had no real claim. Not anymore. Her phone buzzed almost immediately afterward. A text from Charlotte. "I received the legal notice. Will respond swiftly. I'm drafting the filing now. But I wanted you to know, this is exactly what we've been preparing for." Helen replied with a simple, "Thank you." She didn't need to say much. Charlotte had been more than thorough, preparing for every possibility. They had anticipated every move Travis and Janine might make. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it was a post from Janine. A screenshot of their dinner together, accompanied by a mocking caption. "Some people just don't know their place." Delusional? What family? Helen's chest tightened for a moment, the sting of Janine's words biting more than she expected. But she wouldn't let it get to her. She had to stay focused. Janine had always been good at pretending to be kind, pretending to care, while manipulating everything behind the scenes. The post was just another desperate attempt to hold on to some semblance of control. The phone buzzed once more. This time, Lou's voice came through the speaker. "I've got the screenshots of Janine's post. I'll keep everything stored in case we need it." "Don't worry, Helen. They're digging their own graves." Helen leaned back in her chair, the house feeling eerily quiet as she thought of everything that had happened. She had watched Travis and Janine manipulate everyone in their lives, but she had never been able to stop them. Until now. Lou's voice echoed in her thoughts, reminding her that she had allies, people who understood, people who weren't swayed by Travis's or Janine's bluster. And the law, finally, was on her side. As she sat in the kitchen, the letter from Travis's lawyer still lying on the counter, she reached for her own phone and called Charlotte. She needed to be ahead of this, to be the one to steer the ship, to control the narrative. Charlotte picked up almost immediately. "Helen, ready to respond?" she asked, her voice calm and precise. "I'm ready," Helen replied, feeling the weight of the moment in her chest. "Let's file it." Charlotte didn't hesitate. "I'll send over the revised filing. I've attached all the documents we need. The escrow files, the bank transfers, and the dates of when your contributions were made. I've also included the legal history of the house, the payments, and your title rights from the start of the purchase." Helen took a slow breath. This was the moment. The moment they would realize they had no hold over her. "Thanks, Charlotte. Let's get this filed." Her hand lingered over the phone before she hung up. The sound of the receiver clicking into place seemed almost final, a quiet punctuation mark at the end of everything that had led her here. She knew what was coming. She knew the fight wasn't over, that Travis and Janine would keep pressing. But now, the game had changed. She wasn't their pawn anymore. As the hours passed, the tension in the house began to feel almost palpable. Every creak of the floorboards, every hum of the refrigerator, it all felt like it was building toward something. The calm before the storm. The storm she was now ready for. Lou arrived later that day, the familiar rattle of the door announcing his presence. He stepped inside, carrying a stack of papers in his hand. "It's done," he said, a satisfied look on his face as he placed the documents on the table in front of her. "Charlotte's filed everything. We're set." Helen took the papers, feeling the weight of them in her hands. The legal documents, the filings, the letters, the evidence. It was all there. She had crossed the line. She had secured her position. Now it was up to Travis and Janine to deal with the consequences. She picked up her pen, turning to her will, and began to revise the final section. Travis Watterson is to be removed from all assets, and his rights to any inheritance are nullified. Helen felt no hesitation as she signed her name. The ink was final. There was no going back. Lou watched quietly as she finished, the tension between them unspoken but understood. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Yes," Helen said, her voice steady, her gaze never leaving the document. "This is the final step." She paused, the weight of the decision settling in her chest. She hadn't just removed Travis from her will, she had removed him from her life, completely. It was the last thing she could do to protect herself, and in doing so, she would protect everything she had worked for. Helen looked up from the papers and met Lou's gaze. She could feel her heart beating steadily in her chest, her resolve unshakable. This was it. The storm was on its way, but now it was their turn to face the consequences. And when it came, they wouldn't be able to hide from the truth anymore. The game had changed, and she was winning. Helen sat in the dimly lit living room, the only light coming from the soft glow of the security feed on her screen. The house was silent. Every corner of it holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. She wasn't nervous. No, not anymore. The final pieces were in place. The trust, the filings, the will, all set. But even so, something about this moment felt heavier than the others. Perhaps it was the anticipation. Perhaps it was the finality of it all. Her finger hovered over the mouse, her eyes scanning the multiple camera angles set up around the house. It was a quiet evening, the stillness of the neighborhood unbroken. She knew it wouldn't be long before they came. Travis, Janine. The reckoning was near, and they would come for her. The doorbell rang, the sound echoing through the quiet house. Her gaze never left the screen as she clicked on the feed, watching as Travis stood on the porch, fidgeting, his face tight with barely contained fury. She had been expecting him to come, but the calm in her body remained as the man outside her door began his assault on the silence. He knocked this time, louder than usual, his fist pounding like the sound of a ticking clock. She exhaled slowly, her hand remaining still. This was it. This was the moment that would set everything in motion. The door. The words. Everything. Through the feed, Helen watched him lean in, speaking to her with the desperate, accusatory tone she knew all too well. She could hear his words faintly, but she didn't need to listen. She already knew. He was demanding, his voice rising, the words harsh with venom. "Mom, open the door," he was shouting now, his hands pressing against the wood, face contorting with anger. "Undo the filings. Do it now, before it's too late." Helen remained still, her gaze unwavering as she watched him. She could see the desperation in his eyes, the panic that had finally taken root. It wasn't the calm confidence of a man who held the power. No, Travis was beginning to realize how little power he had left, and he hated it. Hated that it had come to this. Lou had already moved to the door, standing just out of frame on the porch, his expression a mirror of the quiet strength that had never wavered. He wasn't fazed by Travis's rants, not in the slightest. Helen leaned back in her chair, feeling a strange satisfaction wash over her. It was the same satisfaction she had felt when she signed the final documents, the feeling of reclaiming what was hers. She was no longer the one pushed aside. Now it was Travis's turn to feel that pressure. Lou opened the door slowly, just enough for his face to appear. His posture relaxed but firm. He didn't move aside. There was no invitation in his body language, no softening of his stance. He stood as a barrier between Travis and the world Helen had made for herself. Travis's voice grew louder, his face flushed with frustration. "You don't get it, do you? I'm your son. You owe me. You owe me, Helen." Lou's voice cut through the anger, steady and unwavering. "She owes you nothing, not anymore." Travis froze, the words stalling him for a moment. He gaped at Lou as if he couldn't believe it, but Lou didn't flinch, didn't give him an inch of room. Helen could see the realization begin to dawn in Travis's eyes. His jaw clenched, and for a moment, he looked less like the man who had once been her son and more like a petulant child whose toys had been taken away. "Are you going to do this to your own son?" Travis spat, his eyes wild with disbelief. "Son?" Lou's voice was almost a whisper, but it had the weight of a judgment. "You lost that right the moment you started treating her like a doormat." Travis took a step back, his face a mask of fury and confusion. "You think you've won? This isn't over. Not by a long shot." Without another word, he turned on his heel and stormed off the porch, his footsteps echoing across the driveway as he left. Helen watched the feed in silence, her hand resting on her lap, a calm stillness spreading through her. Lou closed the door behind him gently and walked back to Helen's side. His face was unreadable, but there was a slight nod of approval. He'll be back. But now he knows. Helen didn't say anything. The words had already been spoken. The game had shifted. And now, Travis was the one trying to catch up. Her phone buzzed once more, breaking the silence in the room. It was Charlotte's name. Helen clicked the screen, her thumb steady as she answered. "Charlotte." "He's not going to stop," Charlotte said, her voice calm, but with an underlying urgency. "But we're ready. I've added the footage from the security cameras to the filing. We've got everything we need to prove harassment." Helen stood up, her body feeling lighter, like she was shedding old weight she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. "I'm ready. Let's do it." Charlotte was already a step ahead. "I'll initiate the full ownership proceedings now. They won't be able to fight this. Not when it's all documented, Not when you've already sealed your place. Helen stood at the window now, looking out at the empty street. The house was quiet again, but it was different now. It was hers, fully and completely. And with each step she had taken, she had rewritten the story of her life, taking back everything they had tried to take from her. She looked down at the papers on the table, the final filing. A small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. The storm had passed, and the floodgates had opened. Helen took a slow breath, the weight of it all settling in. There would be no turning back now. The courtroom buzzed with energy, but to Helen it was just another room. A room where the fate of her family would be determined, but also a room where she no longer felt the crushing weight of guilt. She was calm now, sitting in the back, her posture relaxed, the feeling of control still running through her veins. She hadn't seen Travis and Janine yet, but she knew they would be there, her son and daughter-in-law, walking into this battle not knowing they had already lost. They were the ones who had underestimated her, the ones who thought she would crumble under pressure. When they walked in, it was as if the room's energy shifted. Travis's face was flushed, his shoulders squared with anger. Janine's eyes flickered nervously, the brittle smile she always wore now a thin mask of tension. They were both dressed for war, but it was clear they were not prepared for what was coming. Travis's eyes scanned the room, locking briefly with Helen's. His lips curled into a tight, forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. He made his way to the front, sitting next to his lawyer, a man with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue. Janine, looking uncomfortable, took a seat beside him. Her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Helen sat in the back, her body still, her thoughts quiet. She had prepared for this moment for months. There was no panic, no fear, just a quiet resolve. The judge, a woman with years of experience etched into her face, cleared her throat, calling the room to attention. "Let's get started," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. She glanced down at the case files in front of her, then looked up at the room. "We're here today to review the claim made by Mrs. Watterson regarding the property in question. Mrs. Watterson, please present your case." Helen stood slowly, her gaze meeting the judge's. The room felt oddly distant, as if she were separated from it all, watching herself from outside her body. The steps to the witness stand felt heavy, but each one was a step toward something final. She took the stand with grace, and the judge nodded in acknowledgement. Charlotte stood and approached the bench, documents in hand. "Your Honor, we have here the full history of payments, transfers, and legal rights concerning the property in question," she said, her voice measured but confident. "We have a clear paper trail showing Mrs. Watterson's contributions to the home, from the down payment to the renovations. She holds rightful claim to this property, not only by legal definition but also by every action taken on her part over the years." Helen watched Charlotte work with a sense of admiration. The lawyer's precision, her ability to turn each document into a weapon, was flawless. As she presented the financial history, it was clear. The law was on their side. The lawyer for Travis leaned forward, speaking up. "Your Honor, we are here today to argue that Mrs. Watterson is reneging on promises made to her son and his family. This is a betrayal of a long-standing family agreement, and we intend to have the original terms honored." Helen couldn't help but smirk inwardly. Promises. There were no promises anymore, only legalities, only facts. She could already see the cracks in their defense. The paper trail wouldn't lie. As the judge glanced down at the documents, she turned to Travis's lawyer, motioning for him to clarify his claims. "I'd like to address the dinner incident. You've presented your client's position, Mr. Martin, but I believe we need to clarify certain events that may be relevant to the case. Mr. Watterson," she said, turning to Travis, "can you please explain your actions at the dinner party in question?" Helen stiffened slightly but remained calm. She knew this would come up. She had expected it, and now was the time for Travis to finally account for his behavior. Travis's face flushed even further, but he sat up straighter, trying to maintain composure. "Your Honor," he began, "it was a misunderstanding. My mother has always been difficult and—" The judge cut him off, her voice sharp. "Mr. Watterson, you were reported to have shoved your mother during a social event. A shove that was witnessed by multiple guests, no less. What do you have to say about that?" The courtroom was silent. Helen didn't flinch, but she could hear the shift in Travis's voice as he stumbled through his explanation. It wasn't like that, it was just, she was being difficult. And I just lost my temper. It wasn't meant to be taken seriously. His voice wavered slightly at the end. "Your temper," the judge repeated slowly, eyes narrowing as she leaned forward. "And how do you explain your wife's actions, Mrs. Watterson?" She looked directly at Janine, her tone direct. "You were also involved in this incident, were you not?" Janine shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her gaze darting briefly toward Helen before quickly looking away. I, uh, I wasn't pushing her. I just—" She hesitated, her voice faltering under the judge's scrutiny. It was just a moment of stress. Helen could feel the tension in the room. The judge's silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then she spoke again. "Thank you, Mr. Watterson, Mrs. Watterson," the judge said, her tone colder now. "You may step down." Travis and Janine sat back, their faces flushed with frustration and embarrassment. The reality was settling in. They had no defense. Their actions were out in the open now, and their arrogance was no match for the documentation Helen had provided. As they were dismissed, Helen felt a strange sense of power. The story had shifted, and now it was theirs to tell. The storm had arrived for them. The judge turned back to the papers in front of her. "I'll be reviewing the evidence, and we'll reconvene tomorrow to finalize the ruling." Helen nodded slightly, her chest rising and falling with a steady breath. The waiting wasn't over, but the tide had turned. The house was hers. The victory was hers. But it wasn't just the house. It was the control, the strength, and the dignity she had regained. And when the ruling came, they would understand just how much she had fought to win. As the courtroom emptied, Helen stayed seated, her eyes focused on the judge's desk, her thoughts already ahead. The courtroom was hushed as the clerk moved to the front, holding an evidence folder in her hand. Helen's eyes flicked to Lou, who was seated behind her, his gaze focused but steady. The weight of the moment was almost palpable now. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, but it didn't matter anymore. She was done being pushed around. The judge's voice cut through the silence, calm but firm. "I trust we are ready to proceed, Mrs. Watterson?" Helen nodded, her pulse steady, heart calm. She was no longer the one who had to explain. The truth had already been captured, and now it was their turn to face the music. Lou stood up, moving to the front of the room with a folder in his hand. He passed it to the clerk, who then handed it to the judge. "Your Honor," Lou began, his voice even and controlled. "As requested, we have gathered footage from the evening in question. This footage was recorded by 2 independent witnesses who were present at the dinner." The judge nodded, flipping open the folder. She glanced briefly at the screen behind her, and then the room fell into a tense silence as the footage began to play. It was grainy at first, but it quickly became clear. The camera, from the angle of one of the guests at the table, showed Travis rising suddenly from his chair. The movement was swift, the anger in his body language unmistakable as he shoved Helen aside, his hand pushing her with force. The footage then shifted to show Janine following suit, her shoulder slamming into Helen with a much more deliberate, calculated shove. Helen's stomach tightened, but she didn't flinch. She'd seen this before. What mattered now was that the world was seeing it too. The room was completely still as the footage played out. each second of it like a hammer strike on the lies they had tried to tell. The other guests, frozen in the background, exchanged glances, their faces registering shock and discomfort as they looked on. They didn't intervene. They didn't stop it. The judge, eyes fixed on the screen, didn't speak. But the weight of her silence was clear. It was a silence that carried judgment. When the footage ended, the courtroom was still. Every eye was on the judge as she looked at the screen, then back at the parties before her. "Mr. Watterson, Mrs. Watterson," she said, her voice low and controlled, "you may not have understood the gravity of your actions, but it is now clear. This footage does not lie." Helen felt a small flicker of satisfaction stir in her chest. It was the moment she had been waiting for, when everything they had tried to hide was laid bare, when the truth was undeniable. Travis looked visibly shaken now, his usual bravado slipping away. His skin had gone pale, his jaw tight as he sat frozen in his seat, hands clenched. He couldn't hide from the footage. Not anymore. Janine, on the other hand, glared at the screen with fury in her eyes. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, her hands now tightly clasped on the edge of the table. Lou returned to his seat, and Charlotte stood next, her movements deliberate, controlled. She was ready for the next step. "Your Honor," Charlotte began, her voice carrying with it a quiet certainty. "In addition to this footage, we are submitting evidence of Mrs. Watterson's contributions to the property. The escrow filings, the cash transfers, the renovation records, they all clearly establish Mrs. Watterson's legal claim to the home." She laid out the documents before the judge with an air of finality, each page showing the years of work, of financial investment. Each line reinforced the point. Helen had given more than her fair share, and it was time for the world to recognize that. Helen watched as the judge flicked through the papers, her expression unreadable. The weight of the room seemed to shift as the evidence mounted. Helen could almost feel the shift in the air, the slow realization that Travis and Janine's position was crumbling under the weight of facts, under the undeniable truth. The judge's eyes flicked up from the paperwork, her gaze shifting between Travis and Helen. "Mr. Watterson," she said, her tone now sharp, "you have been presented with clear evidence of your mother's rightful claim. There is no legal argument that justifies your actions or the claims you have made. Your temper is not an excuse for physical aggression, and your misunderstanding of family obligations will not sway this court." Travis opened his mouth, a harsh, indignant sound rising in his throat, but the judge raised a hand, silencing him with a look. "This case is not about promises," she continued, her voice unwavering. "This case is about rights, legal rights, and those rights Mrs. Watterson has clearly demonstrated." Helen felt a calm finality settle over her. The room felt different now. There was no room for doubt. She had won. But the judge wasn't done yet. "The court will reconvene in 24 hours to finalize the ruling," the judge announced, her voice cool. "Until then, I have made my preliminary decision. The house, the property, and all financial contributions are rightfully Mrs. Watterson's." Helen's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't show it. She remained composed, her thoughts steady. She was so close now. Travis shifted in his seat, his face flushed with humiliation. His eyes met hers once more, but this time there was no anger, only frustration and disbelief. Janine, though, was a different story. She glared at Helen, her lips curling into a sneer. She had underestimated Helen. They both had. As the courtroom began to empty, Helen remained seated, the weight of everything finally sinking in. The battle was over. The house was hers. The victory was hers. And with it, her dignity had been fully reclaimed. But she knew that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something much bigger. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation as the judge took her seat, her expression calm, yet the power in her presence unmistakable. Helen sat at the back of the room, her hands folded neatly in her lap, feeling a quiet but deep resolve settle into her bones. She wasn't nervous, she was ready. It had been 24 hours since the hearing, a day that felt longer than any she'd endured before. But now the wait was over. It was time. The judge, after glancing through her notes, looked up at the room. "I've reviewed all the evidence presented by both sides. Mrs. Watterson's contributions to the property, the physical evidence of the altercation, and the testimonies provided leave no doubt as to the validity of her claim." Helen's heart gave a slight jump, but she kept her expression neutral, her hands still. There was no turning back now. The judge's eyes flicked over to Travis and Janine, who sat at the front, their postures stiff and guarded. Janine's lips were pressed tightly together, her eyes flickering toward Helen before quickly averting, while Travis's hands trembled, his jaw clenched in quiet defiance. He had not expected this. The judge's voice broke the silence, firm and final. "In light of the evidence I find in favor of Mrs. Watterson. She has shown that her financial contributions to the property were made in good faith, and the legal rights to the home are rightfully hers." A momentary silence fell over the room, the words hanging in the air like the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. Then, the judge continued, her gaze shifting back to the court. "Furthermore, I am awarding Mrs. Watterson full and controlling interest in the home. The property will be transferred to her name immediately." Helen could feel the tension in the room shift, and for the briefest of moments, it was as if time had slowed. She had done it. She had reclaimed everything they had tried to take from her. Her pulse steadied, but there was no grand celebration. This was about something deeper than ownership. It was about respect. And she had earned it. The judge continued, her tone now more authoritative. "Given the circumstances, I am also issuing a temporary protective order for Mrs. Watterson, effective immediately. This order prohibits any further attempts to interfere with her rights to the property or any harassment from the defendants, including further physical altercations." Travis shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face pale. Janine, ever composed, glanced at him, but there was no comforting expression on her face, only the realization that the court's decision had made their powerlessness final. The judge's ruling had shattered whatever illusions they had left. Charlotte, sitting at the side, leaned forward, making a small note as the judge spoke. When the ruling concluded, Charlotte's quiet, confident voice broke through the hushed room. "Your Honor, we request the immediate securing of all property records and deeds to ensure that Mrs. Watterson's legal claim remains uncontested." The judge nodded. "The property records will be updated accordingly. All documents will be filed under Mrs. Watterson's name immediately." The ruling was final. Helen's grip on the edge of the chair tightened for a brief moment, her breath steady as she absorbed the magnitude of it all. Her victory, her strength. It was now undeniable. As the courtroom began to empty, Helen stood slowly, feeling her body release the tension it had been holding for so long. The long journey was over, and it was time to leave it behind. She glanced over at Lou, who was standing at the back, a quiet smile of approval on his face. He had been with her every step of the way, and now they could finally take a breath. Helen moved toward the door, her footsteps echoing softly on the polished floor. As she reached for the handle, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, seeing Bella's name on the screen. Without hesitation, she answered. "Grandma?" Bella's voice crackled with a mixture of hope and concern. I just wanted to say, I'm so glad you're okay. I'm so happy you're finally going to be all right." Helen's heart fluttered with warmth at the sound of her granddaughter's voice. She stepped outside the courthouse into the cool air, the world feeling different, brighter somehow. Her victory was bittersweet, but in this moment, It was enough to know that Bella would be safe, that she would have a future free from the shadow of what had been. "I'm okay, Bella," Helen replied softly, her voice filled with quiet gratitude. "And I'm going to be just fine." A smile tugged at the corners of her lips as she heard Bella's sigh of relief on the other end. "Take care of yourself, Grandma," Bella said. "I love you." Helen's smile deepened. "I love you too, sweetie." As she ended the call, the weight of the past few months began to lift off her shoulders. The battle was won, but more than that, Helen had reclaimed herself. The door to her past had been firmly closed, but the door to her future was wide open. And as she walked away from the courthouse, she knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The world had underestimated her, but now they would never forget her name. The morning sun streamed through the blinds, casting long shadows across the living room floor. The house was eerily quiet, almost still, as if it were holding its breath for what was about to happen. Helen stood in the middle of the room, her hands clasped in front of her, watching the clock tick away the minutes. Today, everything changed. She could hear the faint sounds of the sheriff's car pulling up outside, the low hum of an engine coming to a halt. The sheriff and his team were here, the final act in the drama that had been set in motion months ago. Helen had prepared herself for this moment. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about reclaiming her dignity, her right to control the narrative. The knock at the door came exactly on time. 2 short raps, followed by a pause. Then another, more deliberate. Helen didn't flinch. She had been waiting for this moment. She walked slowly to the door, her fingers brushing over the handle. When she opened it, there they were. 2 uniformed sheriff's deputies standing in front of her, their faces unreadable but their presence authoritative. "Mrs. Watterson?" one of the officers asked, his voice calm but firm. Helen nodded, stepping aside to let them in. The second deputy carried a stack of paperwork, the thick envelope unmistakable. This was the day of transfer. "I'm here to serve you the final order of property control," the officer continued, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of disturbance. "We'll need to conduct the transfer immediately." From behind her, Helen heard the sound of footsteps. Travis and Janine. They were here, as expected, though neither one of them seemed prepared for what was coming next. Their expressions were a mix of defiance and disbelief, their eyes shifting between the officers and Helen. "Mom, this is insane!" Travis shouted, his voice rising in anger. He looked at the deputies, then back at Helen, trying to plead with them. "You can't just take our house. This isn't right." Janine stood behind him, her arms crossed, her face twisted in frustration. "This is ours, Helen. You've gone too far. You don't have the right." But before she could finish, one of the deputies stepped forward, his stance unwavering. "Ma'am, you need to step aside," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This is a legal order. There's nothing more to discuss." Travis stepped forward, chest puffed out, as if he could physically intimidate the officers. "You don't understand. My mother's been manipulating everything. She can't just—" Another officer stepped in, holding up a hand to stop him. "You need to comply, Mr. Watterson. You're interfering with an official proceeding. Please move aside." Travis faltered, a brief moment of hesitation flickering across his face. Then he opened his mouth again, but the words seemed hollow now. There was no fight left in him. Not against the law. Not against the weight of everything that had been laid bare. Janine, though, wasn't ready to back down. "This isn't over," she hissed under her breath, her eyes locked on Helen. "You'll pay for this." Helen didn't react. She stood still, her face a picture of calm, her posture steady. She had nothing more to say to them. Their words no longer had power. The deputies moved past them, beginning to pull out the official paperwork. The sheriff, who had been standing silently behind them, stepped forward, holding a clipboard. "Mrs. Watterson, if you would please verify these final documents," he said, his voice measured. Helen nodded and took the papers from him. She signed where indicated, her hand steady, the ink flowing smoothly on the page. The legal transfer had been finalized the moment the judge had ruled in her favor, but today, the documents would make it official. Charlotte stood beside her, her expression one of quiet satisfaction as she watched the process unfold. "Everything's in order," she said, as she glanced over Helen's shoulder at the papers. Helen signed one last time, then handed the clipboard back to the sheriff. The final piece of the puzzle was in place. The house, the property, all of it, was now officially under her control. No more games, no more threats. It was hers. As the officers began to process the remaining paperwork, the silence in the room was suffocating. Travis stood with clenched fists, his face flushed with humiliation. Janine turned her back, her eyes tight with anger, but there was nothing they could do anymore. The game had changed. Charlotte turned to Helen, her voice soft but firm. "It's done. You've secured everything." Helen looked at the house that had been so full of chaos, of broken promises, of unspoken resentments. But it was different now. It was her house, her home. And now, more than ever, she knew it would be a place of peace. She glanced at the deputies who were now finishing up the final signatures. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words carrying more weight than they had before. It wasn't just gratitude. It was acknowledgement of what she had fought for, what she had won. The sheriff nodded in return, signaling for his team to prepare to leave. As they turned to head out the door, Helen stood still for a moment, looking at the two figures who had once been so central to her life, but who now felt so far removed. She didn't feel angry anymore. She didn't feel resentment. She just felt free. As the last of the officers left, Charlotte followed them out, leaving Helen standing alone in the doorway. She took a long, deep breath, letting the fresh air fill her lungs, feeling the weight of the past few months settle into her chest. She pulled her phone from her pocket as it buzzed. It was Bella again. "Grandma, I'm so proud of you. I knew you'd make it through." Helen smiled as she listened, her heart swelling with pride for the young girl who had seen her strength from the very beginning. "I'm okay, Bella," she whispered softly. "And I'm going to be just fine." For the first time in years, she didn't have to look back. The future was waiting, and it was hers to take. As the door clicked shut behind her, Helen stepped inside, feeling a quiet but powerful peace fill the space. She was home, and this time, it was for good. The house felt different the moment the last deputy's footsteps faded down the walkway. The quiet wasn't heavy anymore. It didn't press against her ribs or remind her of the voices that had once filled every room with tension. No, this quiet was soft, warm, and deeply hers. Helen stood in the entryway for a long moment, letting the stillness settle into her bones. Then she exhaled, slow and steady, and stepped forward. Her footsteps echoed gently as she moved from room to room, each one a silent inventory of the scars left behind by years of trying to please people who had never learned to appreciate her. In the kitchen, she touched the countertop where her casserole dish had once sat, dismissed, mocked. Now it would be the place where she cooked only for herself, where warmth wasn't conditional. She opened the cabinets, empty in some places, half-heartedly arranged in others. She straightened a stack of plates, smoothing her fingers along the cool ceramic. Small gestures, but grounding ones. She moved next to the living room, where a faint indentation in the carpet marked the place her old armchair had once been, before she'd moved it out years ago to make space for the furniture Travis and Janine preferred. She smiled faintly, the nostalgia bittersweet. "Time to fix that," she murmured. She walked to the garage, found the dolly, and dragged her old chair back inside. It scraped across the floor, wobbling slightly, but she didn't care. She set it back in its old place, the corner by the window where she used to read. The afternoon sunlight fell across the cushion exactly how she remembered. That one change made the room feel like hers again. Helen continued through the house, making small adjustments, replacing the generic artwork Janine had hung with her own watercolor pieces, flipping the throw blankets to the sides she preferred, placing her mother's old vase back on the mantel. These weren't decorations. They were pieces of history, of home, reclaimed. In the quiet of her bedroom, she found her life binder sitting neatly in its box. She pulled it into her lap, the weight familiar, the pages worn by years of notes, updates, and careful planning. She opened it and began adding new instructions, clearer directives for her trust, fresh letters labeled for future moments, and a separate folder simply titled Bella. For Bella, she wrote more than instructions. She wrote memories, guidance, love. Pages and pages filled with the quiet wisdom of a woman who had carried her family longer than anyone realized. Only when her hand grew tired did she close the binder, smoothing her palm across the cover. The sun was dipping low when she finally stepped outside for some air, her jacket wrapped loosely around her shoulders. The breeze carried a hint of autumn, crisp and refreshing. She walked down the little path toward the mailbox but stopped halfway. A small shop down the street had a wooden sign she'd been admiring for weeks. She'd never had the courage to buy it, not while the house was merely hers on paper. But now she could. The store bell chimed softly as she walked in. The owner greeted her warmly, and Helen smiled back, pointing to the carved wooden plaque hanging near the counter. Respect required burned into walnut grain. She bought it without hesitation. Back home, she hung it beside the front door. Not a threat, not a warning, just a statement of truth, of boundary, of reclaimed dignity. She stepped back, admiring it, and that's when she heard a quiet shuffle behind her. Lou stood in the doorway of the living room, hands in his jacket pockets, leaning with the easy familiarity of someone who had always understood her even when she didn't speak. "Feels right, doesn't it?" he said softly. Helen didn't turn at first. She just looked at the plaque. Then at the room, at the warm lighting and the chair back in its rightful place. Finally, she nodded. Slow, certain. "It does," she said. "It really does." Lou gave a small smile, relieved, proud, maybe even a little emotional. "Took you long enough." She laughed under her breath, the sound light in a way it hadn't been in months. "Yes," she agreed. "But I'm here now." The moment was warm, almost perfect, until the sudden vibration of her phone shattered it. A single buzz, then another, then three in rapid succession. Helen's breath halted. She crossed the room and picked it up. An unknown number, 3 missed calls, 1 new voicemail. Lou stepped closer, his brow tightening with concern. Helen's thumb hovered over the screen. The piece she'd reclaimed was about to be tested. Again. The doorbell rang softly, a sound that felt out of place after the weeks of tension and turmoil. Helen stood still for a moment, her fingers lingering on the edge of the door. She had expected Bella's visit, but the reality of it felt heavy in her chest. There was so much to say, so much that had happened in such a short time, and yet, everything felt as if it had already been decided. When she opened the door, Bella stood there, her eyes wide, a mix of emotions playing across her face. Relief, uncertainty, and something else too. But above all, it was the quiet awe of someone who had watched a storm rage and now found herself standing in the calm after. "Grandma," Bella whispered, stepping forward as if unsure whether it was all real. "I'm so glad you're okay." Helen's heart softened. the weight of the past few months melting away in that single moment. She pulled Bella into a tight hug, the girl's warmth and scent of fresh air a welcome relief. For a moment, Helen didn't need to explain. She just needed to hold her, to feel the connection that had been unbroken through all the chaos. "I'm okay, Bella. I'm going to be just fine," Helen said, her voice steady, but with an edge of emotion that she couldn't entirely hide. Bella pulled back slightly, her eyes searching Helen's face. "You've been so strong through all of this. I don't know how you did it." Her voice trembled slightly, the weight of the past few days hanging in her words. "I know what happened with Mom and Dad, but is it really all over?" Helen smiled gently, brushing a strand of hair from Bella's face. "Yes, it's over. Everything's been taken care of. I'm not just here physically anymore, Bella. I'm really here. I've taken back everything they tried to take from me." Bella nodded, a small tear escaping her eye as she hugged Helen tighter, her grip tight and genuine. Helen felt a lump form in her throat, but she swallowed it down. The past was behind her, and Bella would have the future she deserved. After a moment, they pulled apart, and Helen stepped aside to let Bella enter. The house felt even more hers now, each step through the doorway reaffirming the decisions she had made, the life she had fought for. They walked into the living room together, where the soft light of the late afternoon bathed the room in warmth. "You've changed everything," Bella said, looking around. "It feels so different in here now. It feels peaceful." Helen's smile was quiet, knowing that Bella had noticed what only someone with real love and understanding could. "It's mine now, in every way that matters." The doorbell chimed again, this time more definite. Helen turned, her heart skipping a beat as she saw Charlotte standing in the doorway. The lawyer was holding a sealed packet, a confident smile on her face. "Hello, Mrs. Watterson," Charlotte said with a slight nod, stepping into the room. "I've brought the final certified ownership packet for the house." Helen took the packet from Charlotte's hand, her fingers brushing the cold paper. The seal on the envelope was official. The house was truly and finally hers, and it was no longer just an emotional victory. It was now a legal one, too. Charlotte's eyes flicked to Bella and back to Helen. "Everything's been filed, the house, the land, the assets. All of it is now fully in your name, completely under your control." Helen glanced at Bella, who was looking up at Charlotte in awe, understanding the weight of what had just been said. Helen's heart swelled with a deep sense of relief. This wasn't just a house. This was her life, finally free from the weight of disrespect and manipulation. "You've made it," Charlotte continued, her voice softening with sincerity. "You took back what was yours." Helen's smile was steady as she looked at the papers in her hands, but her gaze slowly drifted to the window. There, across the street, she saw them. Travis and Janine. They were standing at the edge of the yard watching the house. They weren't talking, just standing, rooted in place, their eyes filled with something that could only be described as disbelief. They had been the ones who shoved her aside, both figuratively and literally. But now, they were the ones left powerless. Helen closed her eyes for a moment, a deep breath filling her lungs as the magnitude of it settled in. Then, slowly, she turned and looked at the door, at the quiet power she now held. "You've done more than just win," Charlotte said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "You've rewritten everything. They have nothing left to hold over you." Helen nodded, slipping the papers into her bag. She walked to the door, opening it slowly. Her eyes met Travis and Janine's for just a second. The silence between them was thick with history. Their failure, her victory. Travis looked at her, but there was no anger left. Just a bitter acknowledgement of the reality they couldn't escape. Janine crossed her arms tightly, eyes narrowed, but she didn't speak. Helen stood there in the doorway, looking at them. There were no words left to say. Not really. The past had been written, and the future was hers. She closed the door quietly, with the same steady certainty she'd felt when she signed her name to the final papers. They shoved me at dinner, but the next day the house was no longer theirs.